One for Mum, one for Dad, and one for the country.
And there has never been a more exciting time to be an Australian.
Budgets are about choices, Fran, and you show what you value through the choices you make.
Dead, buried, cremated.
This is coal. Don't be afraid. Don't be scared. Won't hurt.
Australia's basically done for. We'll just end up being a third-rate economy. You know, a banana republic.
How good is Australia?
Just follow the money.
G'day and welcome to Follow the Money, the Australia Institute's podcast demystifying the big economic issues in Australia and putting them in plain English. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and this episode we're bringing you another conversation from our webinar series, this time with Deputy Labor Leader in the Senate and Shadow Minister for Government Accountability, Senator Kristina Keneally. This was recorded live on the 5th of May 2021, and things may have changed since recording. So we're here today to talk about accountability, and we know that trust and accountability are essential to any healthy and functioning democracy. But as years of Australia's Institute research shows, trust in our parliament and in politics has been on the decline for many years. There are currently some pretty large gaps in our federal system of accountability. Most notably, there is no National Anti-Corruption Commission, despite the former Attorney General Christian Porter promising one more than 2 years ago now. But on top of that, we've got things like our public broadcaster, the ABC and SBS, having its funding severely cut, also being under constant political pressure. Some of our existing regulatory and accountability mechanisms and bodies, like the Australian National Audit Office, have also faced budget cuts. So there's a range of pressures here. And of course, we've had a series of government scandals and rorts, which seem to attract few consequences. So that's why the Australia Institute is establishing its Democracy and Accountability Program as part of our research, headed up by Bill Brown, who joins us today. And that's why we're thrilled to introduce today's special guest, Senator Kristina Keneally. She's the Deputy Labor Leader in the Senate and the Shadow Minister for Home Affairs, Immigration and Citizenship, and most importantly for today, for Government Accountability. Senator Keneally is also the former Premier of New South Wales, and I'd encourage you to check out her press club speech at the beginning of this year, where she talked about the issue of accountability. It's well worth checking out. You can find it on her website, or I think on the press club's website as well. Thank you so much for joining us today, Senator Keneally. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So I wanted to start out with an issue that's dear to the Australia Institute and our supporters, and that's the idea of a National Integrity Commission. As I mentioned, it's been delayed by a couple of years, but also the government model that's being proposed really probably isn't up to the job. You in particular come from a jurisdiction that has a very strong integrity commission in the New South Wales ICAC. What kind of a difference would it make to have a body like ICAC at the federal level, do you think?
Look, a tremendous difference, and let me unpack that a bit. And I think the work that the Australia Institute's doing with its Democracy and Accountability project is incredibly important to help shape a national conversation and a national push towards a National Integrity Commission. A democracy is not necessarily a given, and that might sound like a funny thing to say from someone who's been in public life in elected office or engaged in politics in one way or another for the last 20 years. But we cannot assume that the democratic institutions and conventions that exist in Australia will continue on unmitigated or unaffected by shifts in the world around us. And quite frankly, we are seeing really disturbing trends in terms of the number of Australians who are losing confidence in democracy and the number of Australians who've actually said that, in fact, in some cases, a non-democratic system, a dictatorial system, if you will, it could be preferable. Now, part of the challenge about democracy and continuing to support it is that it relies on the consent of the governed. And if people who are the community that elect governments lose confidence in those governments, that's when we start to lose confidence in the democratic system. And what erodes confidence in government? It is at its most basic, a belief by the population that governments are no longer on their side, that governments are no longer acting in the national interest, that governments are there for self-serving purposes, that governments are there for the few, not the many. And how does the public see evidence of that? They see it when they see politicians engaged in self-interested corruption, in dodgy deals, in rorts using taxpayer money to support projects that benefit individuals or political parties rather than the national interest. And so when we lose sight of those transparency and accountability mechanisms throughout government, and I've got to say, in many ways, a body like an ICAC in New South Wales or a National Integrity Commission nationally, it should not be necessary, but it is. But it's not the first step in accountability. In many ways, it's kind of the gotcha step. We should also be ensuring that whether it's in our budgeting systems, our decisions about how money is allocated, our transparency, our whistleblower protections. There's a whole range of accountability and transparency mechanisms that have been eroded over the last 8 years of this government and that are fundamental to supporting and upholding transparency and accountability in government. At the end of that does set an ICAC or a corruption body, and it is fundamentally necessary to give the public confidence that there are that essentially sunlight will be brought to bear and transparency will be brought to bear, even if individual politicians or political parties seek to resist it.
I'll just follow up on that. You mentioned in your press club speech earlier this year that sometimes the argument comes up that actually exposing all these acts of corruption publicly also damages the standing of politics, and that's a reason not to have those types of bodies. And you kind of talked about what corruption does in politics. Can you just tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think this is an important point because I get that there is an argument that sometimes is put, particularly that the public just thinks all politicians do this, right? That the public thinks all politicians are self-interested, that both political parties do it, and therefore a pox on everyone's house is they're all bastards is kind of the argument that gets put, and therefore having a corruption body just feeds that. Let's be clear, what feeds the undermining of democracy is not the sunlight and the transparency and the accountability. It is the corruption itself. It is the misuse of public funds. It is the scandals. It is the deals for mates. That is what undermines trust in democratic institutions. And so what we've seen, for example, in places like New South Wales and Victoria and other states where they've had these institutions, is that people have a sense that when there's accountability applied in public, where there is the capacity to use what are extraordinary powers to uncover the things that some people would rather keep hidden about corrupt acts or misuse of taxpayer money, that actually gives people the confidence to know that someone is watching, someone is holding people to account, and someone will ensure that governments remain on their side. Now, as I said, it would, in an ideal world, we wouldn't need these types of mechanisms, but we don't live in an ideal world. And unfortunately, what do we know about power? That power left unchecked and power left without transparency and scrutiny, will at times lead to self-interested decisions. So we need to ensure, and we need to give the public the confidence to know that their democratic voices are being heard and their democratically elected governments are being held to account.
Bill, did you have a question?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I was struck by kind of your comments about waning public confidence in politicians and the way that kind of writing off the political class as a whole undermines the integrity of the system. I think one of the areas we've seen that recently is with concerns around misleading political advertising. These days, it kind of feels like there's not an election that goes by without there being allegations that this or that advertising is misleading. We've seen that there's, at the state level, measures to address this with South Australia's truth in political advertising laws, which have been running since 1985, and last year the ACT adopted those laws as well. I was wondering what you thought the prospects were of truth in political advertising laws at the federal level and whether they'd go some way to increasing public confidence.
Yeah, look, there are a couple of reforms that I think we need to adopt at a federal level. But let me first, just before I go to those, because I think it's important to acknowledge there are things that do exist in our current democratic system that we need to value and uphold, that help value and uphold that help keep governments to account and bolster trust in democracy. So things like an independent Australian Electoral Commission, compulsory voting, the rule of law, freedom of speech, freedom of religion and association, and the oversight and accountability mechanisms that already exist. You mentioned the auditor earlier, Senate estimates, state-based integrity commissions, and then, of course, adding to that, a national integrity commission. I would say some of the other reforms that need to occur and that Labor supports are truth in advertising provisions at a federal level. And I think that's important not just from the standpoint of partisan politics, although it is fundamentally important. We saw that in the last election campaign, claims being made about certain policies that the Labor Party supposedly had that we simply did not. But I think it's also important from the standpoint of foreign interference. And, we have seen play out in the United States and in other jurisdictions, and to a lesser extent in Australia, but there is no reason to think this won't grow. The attempts either by state-based actors or others, non-state-based actors, to spread misinformation and within a political context, whether that be to get a certain point of view up in an election or just to create mayhem and discord. And, we saw that play out in the American election most significantly, both in 2016 and then again in the most recent election. So I think the safeguards that we need to start to think about are challenging ones we haven't grappled with before, but truth in advertising plays a key part in that. There are also going to increasingly be roles for big tech companies, the social media platforms, Facebook, Google, and Instagram and Twitter. But yet, and whether it comes to foreign interference, extremism, misinformation, and their capacity to support democracy, if you will, and to work with democratically elected governments. Just last week, we had a hearing on extremism at the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, and all the tech platforms were there. And it was good that they were, because we are really, as one of them said, we are writing these rules as we go along. This is a really new world. The other thing I would just add in terms of reforms that I think need to be made and that Labor supports, political donations. The threshold for disclosure is too high at about $14,300. Labor has a bill currently in the Senate to lower that to $1,000. And also, we believe that disclosure should be made far more quickly. Right now, you can wait up to 19 months until after an election to know who is donating to political parties. We have a bill in the Parliament that would seek to make that disclosure within 7 days. These are some of the key reforms to enhance democracy and the transparency and accountability around it that we would bring into law should we win at the next election.
Bill, I know you've done some research on the Senate being kind of the home of accountability in Parliament. I just wondered if you had a question that kind of related to some of those mechanisms that already exist that the Senate has been touching on.
Yeah, so Australian Institute's done a bit of research into kind of the role of the Senate, as you say, but also Australians' perceptions of the Senate. And what we've found as a whole is that Australians recognise its importance, but they're not always clear on the exact details of what powers it does and doesn't have. There's a bit of confusion over kind of powers that the US Senate has that the Australian one doesn't, and so on. But it's still, the Australian Senate has these kind of remarkable powers, orders for the production of documents, the committee system, Senate estimates. And I've kind of looked at that at a kind of intellectual level, but I'm interested in your experience as a senator practically, kind of what does the Senate do to hold the government to account?
Well, as you might expect, I'm a big fan of the Senate. I think it's where the real work of Parliament happens. And I say, I mean, it's a joke at one level, the continual debate between House and Senate members. But in reality, the Senate is where legislation can be scrutinized, where legislation, where the government has to really prove that the legislation has merit. So it's often where legislation is stopped, bad legislation is stopped, or bad legislation is amended in order to make it acceptable. It's also in terms of the accountability mechanisms. And I think you're right to point out things like the order for production of documents, the requirement of a minister to present him or herself to the Parliament and explain themselves, the power to call witnesses before Senate committees. They are extraordinary powers. And if anything, they have become more important in recent years, given that we've seen, as Ebony pointed out, cuts to Auditor Generals and the like. Some of the Auditor General's more recent reports, indeed one that comes out today on the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, have been prompted because the Senate first decided to scrutinize a decision of government. But the flip side of that is that as the Senate is growing more important and I dare say more sophisticated in its use of its accountability mechanisms, the government of the day, the current Liberal national government, is finding more and more ways to avoid that accountability. So we did a little experiment, I think it was last year, with Senate estimates, where we started to count every day the number of times they took a question on notice. And sometimes they would take questions on notice that were just completely answerable. They just simply didn't want to give an answer in a public setting. And we started to count the number of times they took a question on notice. And at every meal break, so at lunch and dinner, we published them online. And boy, that within a day, the number of questions taken on notice dropped down. And but yet it's creeping back up, and continually the government seeks to avoid that scrutiny. Again, my point being that we can't take any of these things for granted, and a government, if it wanted to, or if it had the numbers in the Senate with maybe a friendly crossbench, could ram through some significant changes that would curtail that scrutiny capacity.
Speaking of scrutiny and the role of the Senate, but also, I guess, other bodies, in your press club speech, again, you talked a lot about the kind of special purpose funds that this government in particular seems to be using a lot more of. You mentioned things like Building Better Regions, which is $1 billion. Obviously, we had the Sports Rorts program, community development grants, drought communities program. There's a lot of kind of special purpose funds, and you identified, I guess, some issues with how they're managed. And we've also talked about the fact that other agencies that scrutinise spending, like the Audit Office, have had their funding cut. Can you just talk to me a little bit about the problem with those types of grants that we're seeing emerge?
So this is a budgeting trick that Scott Morrison has really took on board when he was treasurer, and is now carried through to near perfection, he might think, as prime minister. And that is to create all these pockets of money in the budget for special purpose, fund type allocations that essentially have very few or no rules or guidelines around how the money is to be spent, and where the decision is at the discretion of the minister or a group of ministers. And so you mentioned the Community Development Fund. Let's take that one as an example. The Community Development Fund started out as a $340 million fund during the Abbott government. And at one level, it's not a bad thing. Governments might have small pockets of money to give out small grants to local community groups to do things they wouldn't otherwise be able to do. I can remember when I was a local member, we gave a small grant to a church to refurbish their kitchen so they could do better outreach to local homeless communities. Fine, great. Here's the thing, though, with the Community Development Fund under this coalition government, it has now grown since 2013 to a $2.5 billion fund. $2.5 billion. And here's the kicker. To be able to receive money from this fund, you have to be invited by the government to apply. There's no open application. There's no guidelines. There's no rules. So, no prizes for guessing which electorates and which kinds of community groups get the bulk of this funding. And this is repeated over and over in the budget. The Safer Communities Fund, the Female Facilities Sports Fund, the Urban Congestion Fund. And, one of the things we'll be scrutinizing in next week's budget is the extent to which these funds have just continued to grow. This is a deliberate design feature of the budget. So sports rights, which is possibly the most notorious, was a $100 million program. Community development grants, $2.5 billion. Sports rights was a tip of an iceberg in terms of how this government is using taxpayer money, like it is Liberal and National Party money, and doling it out just prior to elections to suit their political purposes. And let me leave you with this. The next time you hear the Prime Minister justify decisions taken under these types of funds by saying, oh, well, the minister complied with the guidelines, that's because the guidelines say the minister can do whatever he or she wants, that there are no rules. So, this is when I talk about when the public needs to have confidence that their money is being spent in their interest and not in the interest of political parties or individual politicians. It is having merit-based processes, independent and transparent applications where everyone gets a fair go, and then the ability for offices like the Auditor General and a National Anti-Corruption Commission to scrutinize the decisions of government.
Yeah, I think we've got about 530 people on the line with us here today. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. Just a reminder, you can type in a question using the Q&A function. We've probably got time for one or two more questions from Bill and I, and then we'll go to questions from the audience. I did just want to follow up on that, Kristina, with particularly the role of the Auditor General and the Australian National Audit Office. And I feel like in the last couple of years, it feels like sometimes the last line of defence, how we can find out about how government is spending taxpayers' money. But as we've touched on, it's had its funding cut. What else do we need to be doing to strengthen some of those existing accountability mechanisms that are in place?
Look, I think that that you're right to point out that the cuts, that is just extraordinary, and particularly at a time when their workload is increasing. Some of the other challenges that we face in terms of our supposedly independent bodies is the increasing decisions by this government to appoint former Liberal MPs, national MPs, and Liberal and national staffers to these independent bodies that are supposed to provide scrutiny or accountability or decision-making responsibility from government. So if you think about things like the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, which has been stacked out with political appointees, the fact that half of the Abbott ministry currently hold appointed government jobs, appointed there by their mates in the current government.
Is that true? I didn't know that.
Extraordinary. This year alone, we have seen the Morrison government, this year 2021, which we're only in May now, we've seen the Morrison government appoint a political Liberal or National staffer or MP to one job a week. One job a week. And the most egregious being the Fair Work Commission, which is supposed to, ensure that working Australians have fair pay and conditions. One of the appointees to that is the daughter, a deputy mayor in southwestern Sydney, and the daughter of a former Liberal MP. She's been appointed to a 26-year contract worth $10 million. To the Fair Work Commission, ordinary Australians could only dream of that type of job security. But how can we be ensuring that we have transparent and appropriate and independent processes when we have political appointees being put into these types of roles? Now, the government will say, and they've already claimed all these people are qualified. It's not. And maybe some of them are. I haven't scrutinized all their CVs. But it is the appearance of the politicization of our independent bodies that are meant to be independent, that are meant to be assessing things on merit, that are meant to have the qualifications and the skills. And I think it'd be fair enough if you, for example, if you look at the AAT, there's been quite a lot of scrutiny of the fact that many of the appointees don't have relevant legal qualifications for those roles. So these are key metrics, I guess, that we can use to look at whether or not the government is acting in the national interest and is on the side of the Australian people, or is taking decisions that's on the side of themselves and their Liberal and National mates.
We've got time for one last question from you, Bill, and then we'll head to questions from the audience.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, keeping the government to account is such a natural function of the opposition, and that's one reason I'm so happy to see it kind of formalised in your role. But you mentioned in your address that no one gets into politics to be in opposition, and I'm wondering what can you do while in opposition to kind of ensure that you keep the courage of your convictions in government and make sure that are there plans to keep the portfolio if Labor wins the next election, for example?
Oh, that's an interesting question. I haven't asked the leader yet if I get to be a government accountability minister in an Albanese Labor government. But I think, to be frank, I have often said that my role as Shadow Minister for Government Accountability isn't to supplant or take the place of the jobs that all my colleagues are doing in their individual portfolios, but rather to amplify and to draw together where we see the pattern of incompetence or waste or mismanagement or rorts or scandals that is occurring across the government. But the way a government should be holding themselves to account is to, one, make clear what their commitments are and to deliver upon them. And when I was in government in New South Wales, we had a New South Wales state plan, which we publicly reported on every year, that covered our main commitments. Now, whether you have that type of approach, Anthony, we have, of course, our platform, and Anthony has made clear through a series of vision statements the values that we uphold as the Australian Labor Party, and we are now releasing the policies that we will take to the next election. But I would say that the significant commitment that we have already made, and we will have more to say about in coming months, is our commitment to introduce a National Integrity Commission, an anti-corruption body, one that is transparent, one that has the capacity to look backwards, to examine decisions that have been taken by previous governments, one that conducts its hearings or is able to conduct its hearings in open, one that is able to examine the decisions of ministers and MPs. These are all fundamental aspects of what give the public confidence in anti-corruption bodies. I have heard some people argue that perhaps it's best if these hearings are held in secret. My view is, and the view that our Shadow Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus, has put, is that we need to be able to, at times, have hearings in public because it's fundamental to demonstrate to the community when a body makes a finding of corruption that the evidence upon which they relied. All of these things, we are an open democratic society, and democracy abhors secrecy. And to the extent that government processes like an anti-corruption commission should be conducted in open, they absolutely should. So that is the fundamental accountability mechanism and commitment that Labor is making under an Albanese Labor government.
Thank you very much. I think we might go to questions from the audience now. I can see we've got quite a few here. I'm going to start with one from someone called Bill Arnold. He says, is there a method to ensure that all royal commissions could include a full fiscal audit? Example, to just follow the money in certain cases. I guess we've seen a huge number of royal commissions in recent years.
Well, look, royal commissions have extraordinary powers and can examine whatever they essentially where the evidence leads. They have terms of reference, of course, but often royal commissions will come back to governments and say we need to alter or extend or change so that we can look at this or that aspect. I would say that the responsibility for financial auditing shouldn't just lie with royal commissions, though. We shouldn't just be relying on a royal commission. And indeed, there are bodies like the Parliamentary Budget Office, which was introduced under the last Labor government, that also provide that type of scrutiny and accountability. The Audit Office does as well. And of course, parliamentary debate and examination. Parliament, for example, I was part of the Senate inquiry into the Great Barrier Reef Foundation allocation of $444 million to that body. So I think we do have multiple ways in which we can follow the money, but I certainly think it's quite within the remit of royal commissions to do that should they need to.
Thank you. The next question is from Michael Lester. He says, how can the blight of revolving door from politics and bureaucracy to corporations in sectors such as mining and defence be effectively redressed? We've already touched on political appointments. Yeah. This is a bit similar.
But this is an interesting point in terms of political appointments, or indeed for particularly senior bureaucrats, the extent to which people's are, for example, the Ministerial Code of Conduct supposedly prohibits people from taking up employment in their areas within a certain period of time after they've left office. But yet we have seen examples of where that is not enforced by this government. And the point I have consistently made about the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, is that he doesn't reward bad behavior. He doesn't punish bad behavior. He rewards it. And part of a ministerial code of conduct and part of the privilege of serving as a minister should also be abiding by the terms of that code of conduct while in office, and indeed once you have left, to the extent that it applies to you once you've left. Again, I come back to the capacity of an anti-corruption commission. This might, in certain circumstances, this might be an area that they seek to scrutinize.
The next question is from Sally Keir. She says there definitely needs to be reform in accountability systems, but would confidence in the democratic system be also reinforced if people were educated in how it actually works and how they can participate, not only by voting, but also being able to lobby members of parliament and ministers and participating in other community feedback processes?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting question, because sometimes it's one of the most common questions I get from members of the public is, how do I write a submission? What does it look like? Does it really matter if I write to my MP? And they're sometimes surprised when I say, look, a submission can just be a letter, or, of course it matters when you write to your MP. If you get, 30 letters as an MP on a subject, you start to go, what's going on here? If people are picking up pen and paper or sending you an email with their considered thoughts. So I think there's some value in that. And when I talk about upholding democratic institutions like an independent electoral commission, like compulsory voting, I think what does have to go hand in hand with that is providing more ways for citizens to participate in democracy. I think back to one of the statements that Gough Whitlam made, which was, our goal is to work with the Australian people. I'm paraphrasing here, but it was essentially our goal is to work with the Australian people so that they can participate in the decisions, with their government on the things that affect their lives. And, that has to be the fundamental aspect of democracy. To some extent, that can start in school, but I don't think it ends in school. I think that the risk that we have sometimes taken is that we forget that everything we've learned in I was in high school 30 years ago. Twitter didn't exist then. Emails didn't exist then. I think I met my congressman in America once. Now we're out doing mobile offices on weekends. The ways in which we participate in the democratic process have changed, and those should be lifelong engagements from governments, building up the democratic capacity of its citizenry.
Yeah. Bill, you mentioned you had done some research around people's understanding of the Senate. Is there anything else that sheds light on what the public does or doesn't understand about how the Parliament works?
Yeah, well, a few years ago, we did ask people a kind of a range of questions. Would you feel comfortable approaching your local member with an issue? Do you even know the name of your local member? Have you ever spoken to them? That kind of thing. And I think, unfortunately, having met a local congressman once would probably put you ahead of many Australians who don't have a lot of access to politicians. One of the things we recommended in that time was actually to increase the number of politicians so that they represent fewer people and have more chances to meet with them. But there's a lot of ways that we could get people more involved in the political process. Party membership is pretty low, and the average age of party members is very high. There's a lot of room for improvement in Australia.
Well, and what you're doing right now with these webinars, and I do think this is one of the great innovations that have come out of COVID, is as tragic as COVID has been, both in terms of a health crisis and an economic crisis, is that it has created these new forums. And so commend the Australia Institute for doing these webinars, because it is allowing us to have these conversations that we might have struggled to have in with 600 or so people in normal times.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. The next question follows on from something you've already talked about with the kind of special purpose funds. So Lars Bendel asks, if these funds are so questionable, how did they pass the Parliament? Did Labor vote for them? Can you just tell us how these kinds of things come into existence?
A lot of these funds don't require legislation. In fact, most of them don't require legislation. They are they're created by government department. They're created by ministers, or they're created, within the funding envelope of a department, and don't require law to be passed for them to be created. I think that, and let's be clear, all governments have had various types of funds to do various types of special purpose things that, for example, the intended goal of the Female Facilities Sports Fund is quite laudable. The idea that more girls are playing sports that they haven't traditionally played, like AFL or NRL or cricket, and that we need to be able to provide more facilities, change rooms and the likes to facilitate that. That's quite laudable. And it's the kind of thing that governments often would create funds for. It is the lack of transparency, the lack of guidelines, the lack of rules, the willingness to act against department advice, and the capacity to have utter and complete discretion by a minister, by an elected minister. Those are the challenges around these funds. And the only way that in this current environment that we can apply, that we can highlight this, is to apply scrutiny both through what we do as an opposition, but also through forums like the Auditor General. So, for example, earlier this year, ABC 730 and my office has done some additional scrutiny, highlighted that Peter Dutton, as Home Affairs Minister, was essentially using the Safer Communities Fund as a way to boost the coalition's chances in the Tasmanian by-elections during the Section 44 citizenship by-elections. And he gave out 2 grants before the guidelines were even written. He spent $36,000 of taxpayer money flying down to Tasmania to announce them. His department warned him not to make these grants. They told him he would likely attract scrutiny and criticism, that they weren't justifiable. He still went ahead and did it, and he didn't break any laws or any rules because the rules said he could do whatever he wanted. Now the Auditor General has opened up an audit into those grants and into that fund. So it is about making sure that the accountability mechanisms, both through the Senate, through the media, who play an important role in accountability, and through things like the Audit Office, are supported and in place. But I think an additional layer is the National Integrity Commission.
Mm. The next question is from Michael Lester. He says, how can increasing government secrecy in cabinet, security and commercial in confidence be reduced, and FOIs, that's freedom of information requests for people who aren't aware, be strengthened?
Yeah, so last year, the Parliamentary Joint Committee on Intelligence and Security, of which I'm a member, published a report on media freedom, which was occasioned by the 2 infamous raids on the ABC and the News Corp journalist in relation to national security information. And while that was a narrowly construed report in terms of looking at the connection between national security laws and media freedom, it did go to some of these other issues about the increasing trend within government to classify information more secret than necessary, that freedom of information requests were taking longer, were being increasingly refused or restricted, and so the committee did make some important recommendations about some changes that were required in relation to the overall access to information, protection from whistleblowers, and the like. We noted were matters that were raised in our submissions, and while they didn't directly go to our terms of references, merited significant examination and changes. That the culture of secrecy, combined with the what was described as a chilling effect on media in terms of that secretive or punitive culture of police raids, was really creating was inimical to a liberal open democracy. I will just say, though, I think it's important to remember, particularly in terms of there are some things that do need to be kept confidential, and I respect that within government. There's some national security information, there is some commercial and confidence information that is legitimately required to be kept confidential. But it's about getting the balance right. It's about having the right independent testing mechanisms. And it is about respecting the fact that we are a liberal, open democracy where people should expect transparency from their government. And this, to circle back to where I began, it's why it's not just about a National Integrity Commission. It's about having a culture across government that respects openness and transparency and believes accountability is important. And when that exists, and when the public can expect that from their government, whether it's an auditor general, whether it is freedom of information, whether it is protecting whistleblowers, whether it is disclosure of political donations, whether it is having a National Integrity Commission, all of those things are fundamental, all of them, to supporting people's consent for their democratic government.
The next question I've got kind of follows on a little bit from that. It's from Sylvia Morgan. She says, does the national broadcaster play a role in calling for government accountability? Absolutely. Can you just talk to us a little bit more about those raids and the role of the media, but the ABC in particular?
This is a great question because it is a key part of our as we look forward to in a very challenging world, to having a voice that is trusted, that is not subject to the ownership structure, and that is respected by the Australian people as a voice, as an independent voice. And I say in the challenging future that we face, I spoke earlier about foreign interference. We've also seen the ability for algorithms and tech companies to be able to separate us up into our little tribes and only present us with information that conforms to our already held views. And so, and this is something, that separate to this question, this is something we will have to grapple with in terms of greater transparency around those algorithms, greater rules around how those companies operate. Because quite frankly, that is also a challenge to our public conversation. But right now we do face misinformation, we face foreign interference, we face the challenges of the separating out and the fact that you are often not presented with a different point of view in a context that allows for conversation and debate. And so you end up with these echo chambers online. And the role of an independent, taxpayer-funded news source, and one that can apply scrutiny and accountability, and one that is one of the most trusted and relied upon voices in the Australian landscape, is fundamental. And so when we talk about cuts to the ABC, it's not just about programming or entertainment content, although that's important. It is also about the ability to apply proper scrutiny and news coverage. And we know from Senate estimates that the cuts have, as the ABC managing director told us, cut into muscle now. It's not as if there is fat there to cut. And so this is another way in which we can erode public accountability when we erode the role of the public broadcaster.
I've got a couple of questions here, one from Martin Johnson and one from Karen Jones, that touch on the idea of ministerial accountability and basically ask what happened to it. Do you have any views on that?
Oh, it's laughable, but it's also tragic. And this is back to my point about, what does the ministerial code of conduct stand for if it's not enforced? And, so we all know, the Angus Taylor, the Stuart Roberts, the Michaelia Cashes, the Linda Reynolds, and that's before we even get to the whether or not there's been an independent investigation into Christian Porter and the allegations against him. We have just seen example after example where ministers are not punished for poor performance or for misdeeds, but in fact go on to be rewarded. Ultimately, this is not, I sound like a broken record, but a National Integrity Commission, this is one of the reasons it's absolutely fundamental. When you have ministers, who have been stood down or who have faced criticism or scrutiny for taking decisions that either serve their private interests or appear to serve their private interests, that would be that's a fundamental area of scrutiny that a National Integrity Commission would be able to consider. But when you also have ministers doing things like forging documents to have a hit on the City of Sydney Lord Mayor, or you have ministers who have repeatedly misled the Parliament or who have failed to cooperate with AFP investigations, or who have been responsible, and of course, who've been responsible for things like robo-debt. And of course, We remember who the treasurer, the social services minister, and then the treasurer was through the implementation of robo-debt, and that was Scott Morrison. Nobody seems to be responsible for anything in this government, and that is because the modus operandi of this government is to outsource all decision making and risk to someone else, and we've seen that through COVID. We have seen that through a range of decisions by this government, and one, that is our responsibility as an opposition. It is the responsibility of the media. It is the responsibility of institutes and think tanks like the Australian Institute, and it's the responsibility of every citizen to demand that accountability from their elected officials. So there's no, if we are, the erosion of democracy occurs when people in elected office are not held accountable and are allowed to serve their own interest ahead of the national interest. And, while a National Integrity Commission is a fundamental plank in that, it is not the only plank, and all of us have a role to play in holding governments to account.
I've got a couple of questions here that touch on the idea of defamation law reform and what prevents reforming them to give greater weight to public interest so that investigative journalism and accountability via the media can do its work. And I guess just reflecting on the fact that it seemed to hinder a lot of Me Too stories initially, and alleged perpetrators could kind of sue the women coming forward and disclosing sexual harassment and other abuse that they endured. Do you have anything to say on defamation law and what reforms could be required there?
I might defer that to my colleague, the Shadow Attorney General, Mark Dreyfus. It was an area we briefly looked at in terms of the PJCIS inquiry into media freedom, but ultimately decided wasn't part of our terms of reference in terms of national security. I would say that there are some aspects of how the media operate. If I could just segue to something I'm better prepared to talk about, which is the contestability of journalist information warrants. And I just want to briefly speak to this because if a national security agency wants to get a warrant in relation to a journalist and say their metadata or their phone records, those warrants, the PJCIS recommended should be contested by a public interest advocate. That is somebody, we didn't argue that the journalists themselves should be notified that they were potentially the subject of a warrant, but we did say a public interest advocate that could speak on behalf of the public when such a warrant was being sought by a government agency was a way to uphold the idea of public interest and public scrutiny. And I would say that I mention that because it is an example of where we've tried to grapple with the notion of the public interest, media, and the need for secrecy in certain circumstances. Whether that's directly applicable in terms of defamation and the type of cases you outlined, I'm not able to say, but I think it points to a parliamentary committee trying to grapple with those types of questions.
We've probably only got time for one last question, and this might be a little bit left field, but Anne-Marie Newton is asking about workplace gender in Parliament and the different electorate offices around the country. With everything that's been coming out over the past few months, would you be able to update us on, where we're at, what has changed, and where to from here?
Yeah, so it's a great question. And many of you will recall that the Prime Minister initially said he was going to have a review of the culture and the workplace practices at Parliament House, and it was going to be done by one of his own MPs, Celia Hammond. Now, Celia is a lovely person. I don't have anything against her, but, that's not the appropriate response to the crisis and the challenges that were identified following the revelations about Brittany Higgins' alleged assault here in Parliament House. So the Kate Jenkins, Labor called for this to be an independent review and for it to be involving both parties, indeed all parties. The government has agreed to that. Kate Jenkins is undertaking that now and has been consulting with all the parties and with staff here in the Parliament House as well. And we look forward and we continue to work with her, and we look forward to the outcomes of that review. I think it's quite appropriate that she's doing that. In the meantime, the Australian Labor Party has released new policies on harassment, on bullying, and a new complaints process for particularly relating to not just to staff, but indeed to all members of the Australian Labor Party. And that has been done following a significant period of consultation across the party and with our staff in order to ensure that people had support people within the party they could go to, clear complaint mechanisms, and a clear understanding of how those complaints would be resolved. And very much so to provide confidentiality where it's required, and to help to find outcomes that are acceptable and desirable by the complainant. I'm not claiming we've perfectly nailed it, but I do think we have done a significant amount of work, and no doubt there is more to come, particularly following the outcome of the Jenkins review.
Thank you. I'm afraid we're going to have to wrap it up there. Thanks so much for joining us, Senator Kristina Keneally and Bill Brown. We really appreciate your time today. Thanks, everyone, for all your great questions.
This has been a special webinar episode of Follow the Money. All our webinars are free and available on the Australia Institute's YouTube channel, which you can find at australiainstitute.tv. All our latest research and content is at our website, australiainstitute.org.au, and we're on Twitter at the Oz Institute with an AUS. My Twitter handle is ebony_Bennett with a NNT, and this episode was produced by Jennifer Macy, and you can find her at Jennifer Macy. Our theme music is by Jonathan McFeet from Pulse and Thrum, with additional music by Blue Dot Sessions. Thank you for listening to Follow the Money, and have a great summer.